How does one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe just collapse? In only 15 years, the French monarchy went from the height of absolute power to complete ruin. Now, this isn't a story about a single event. It's about a pressure cooker that had been building for years, filled with debt, inequality, and a king who just couldn't make a decision. We're going to see how all those political missteps and all that public anger finally, and spectacularly, boiled over.
So, how did it all unfold? Here's our game plan. First, we'll look at a kingdom that was already cracking at the seams. Then, and this is the interesting part, we'll see how the first real challenge came from the top, not the bottom. After that, we'll watch as the common people finally find their voice, feel the explosion as Paris erupts, and then witness one single night that literally erased 1,000 years of tradition.
All right, let's set the scene. The year is 1774. A new king, a young Louis XVI, has just taken the throne. On the surface, he's inherited the cultural center of the world, a kingdom of glittering palaces and high fashion. But underneath all that gold leaf, the foundations were deeply, deeply rotten. And this was the world he inherited, the Ancien Regime, or the Old Regime. It was a society built on this rigid, centuries-old pyramid. At the very top, you had the king, whose power was seen as absolute, handed down from God himself. It was a system where your entire life was basically mapped out the second you were born.
And the man at the top of that pyramid? Well, he wasn't exactly cut out for the storm that was brewing. I mean, it says a lot when your own brother describes you this way. This indecisiveness would become his fatal flaw, turning problems he could have solved into the crisis that would consume him.
This right here, this slide, lays bare the fundamental injustice of the whole system. Just think about this for a second. You have the clergy and the nobility, who make up maybe 2% of the population. They own most of the land, they have all the power, and they pay next to nothing in taxes. That means the other 98% of France, everyone from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest banker, was footing the entire bill for the country.
And that bill was staggering. We're talking about decades of over-the-top spending and incredibly expensive wars, like, helping fund the American Revolution. All of that had left the kingdom completely drowning in debt. By 1786, we're looking at something like 3.3 times billion livres, an astronomical sum.
But it's this number that really shows you they were in freefall. It wasn't just the total debt that was the problem. It was that every single year the government was spending 112 million livres more than it was taking in. The country was, to put it simply, bankrupt.
So the king had to do something about this financial mess. But here's the crucial turning point. His attempt to fix it backfired spectacularly. And the first domino to fall wasn't pushed by some peasant with a pitchfork. It was pushed by the most privileged people in the entire kingdom, the nobles themselves.
Let's just walk through this timeline because you can see the train wreck happening in slow motion. You have a series of finance ministers who all look at the books and come to the exact same logical conclusion. The rich have to start paying their fair share. The real flashpoint comes in 1787. The finance minister, Cologne, proposes this radical idea, a land tax that applies to everyone, no exceptions for nobles or clergy. Now, to get his plan approved, the king doesn't call a parliament. No, he does something else. He calls an assembly of notables, basically a hand-picked group of the most powerful elites in France. He figures, these are my guys, they're loyal, of course they'll back me.
Nope. Flat out no. In a shocking power play, they refused to rubber stamp the king's plan. Instead, they demanded to see the royal books and insisted that only a body called the Estates General, a medieval assembly that hadn't met in 175 years, had the authority to approve new taxes. This was the aristocratic revolt, and just like that, a money problem became a full-blown political crisis.
See, by challenging the king, the nobles thought they were cracking open a door just enough to grab more power for themselves. What they didn't realize is that they had just kicked that door wide open, and a much, much larger group of people was about to storm right through it.
With his back against the wall, Louis XVI had no choice. He called the Estates General. So, in May of 1789, 1,200 representatives from all three estates gathered at the Palace of Versailles. And all the frustrations of the Third Estate, which had been simmering for generations, were finally about to hit a boiling point.
And you have to understand the kind of ideas that were buzzing around. A hugely influential pamphlet by a clergyman, Abbé Sieyès, asked a simple question: what is the Third Estate? His answer was electric. He argued that the Third Estate isn't just part of the nation, it is the nation. And those other two privileged groups, they were basically freeloaders, parasites living outside the true French nation.
And they didn't just talk, they acted. First, they refused to play by the old rules, where the other two estates could just outvote them. Then, on June 17th, they made a revolutionary move. They declared themselves the National Assembly, the real representatives of the French people. A few days later, they show up to their meeting hall and find the doors locked by the king. So what do? They march down to a nearby indoor tennis court and swear a solemn oath to not stop meeting until they have written a constitution for France. This was it, a direct challenge to the king's absolute power.
All this political chess being played in Versailles? It was about to be swept clean off the board by a tidal wave of pure rage from the streets of Paris. While the politicians were debating, the people of the city were being pushed to the absolute brink.
It really all came down to a perfect storm of three things. First, hunger. The harvest had failed and the price of bread, the food that kept people alive, had gone through the roof. We're talking 90% of a worker's daily pay. Second, fear. The king, getting nervous, moved 20,000 royal troops to surround Paris. People were terrified. And finally, the spark. On July 11th, the king fired Jacques Necker, the one minister the people actually trusted.
That news about Necker being fired hit Paris like a lit match to gasoline. The city erupted. A huge crowd, desperate to find weapons to defend themselves, marched on the Bastille. This was a medieval fortress, a prison that for centuries had symbolized the king's tyranny. When it fell on July 14th, it was more than just a military victory. It was a symbol that the king's power in his own capital had completely and utterly collapsed.
The fire that was lit in Paris didn't stay there. It spread like wildfire across the entire French countryside, sparking peasant revolts and leading to one of the most unbelievable nights in all of European history.
And here you can really see the two fronts of the revolution opening up at once. While Paris was storming the Bastille, a wave of rumor and panic called the Great Fear swept through the countryside. Peasants, terrified that the nobles were about to crush them, decided to strike first. They attacked manor houses and burned the feudal records, the very documents that had legally bound their families to the land for generations.
So back at Versailles, the members of the National Assembly are hearing these reports of chaos, of castles being burned, and they are panicking. They know they have to do something dramatic to calm things down. So on the night of August 4th, they hold an emergency all-night session that is going to change everything.
What began as a strategic move to pacify the peasants turned into this incredible, unbelievable chain reaction of what's been called patriotic delirium. One after another, nobles and clergy members stood up and, in a wave of emotion, renounced their own ancient privileges. Feudal dues, gone. Special hunting rights, gone. Church tithes, tax exemptions, all of it. The entire legal structure of the old regime was torn down piece by piece in a single night.
In one incredible summer, they had demolished a system that had stood for 1,000 years. The age of privilege was dead. The age of the citizen had begun. But in tearing down the old world, they opened up a terrifyingly uncertain future. The old regime was gone, sure, but now came the hard part. What on earth would they build to take its place?